Today we're looking at the story only found in Luke about the rich fool and talking about inheritance. Now, my husband and I are at the point in our lives where we're looking at what retirement can look like. And we've got a lot of friends who are either in the process of retiring or thinking about retiring or have recently retired. So it's kind of the subject among us with a lot of our friends and peers. And we're looking at things, like powers of attorney and who inherits what and um, uh, who is going to be the executor and which of our children we assign with the tasks of taking care of us when we're old and doddering and can't do it ourselves, and having these conversations with our children. What job do you want to do? What decisions do you want to make? This is how your father wants to be buried. This is what I want to happen to my body. We all need to have these conversations, and they are good and proper conversations. The people Jesus was dealing with in the scriptures today didn't have these conversations, or if they did, they were not respected conversations. First, we have a young man who comes to Jesus and asks him to arbitrate, to tell his brother to give him his share of the inheritance. Now, it wasn't uncommon for rabbis and learneds to actually be in the position of judge or advocate in such a position. So that wasn't the strange part at all. What was really interesting, though, is for him to ask Jesus to intervene with the process. Because the regular types of inheritance in that time were that however many children there were, and daughters could inherit. It was up to the will of their fathers. It wasn't in law, but it wasn't not in law either. It was one of those common practice things. So however many children you have, say you had 6 children, you divided everything in 7 parts, because the first child always got twice what everybody else inherited. So that was the process. So if this man who came to Jesus was inheriting, if it was his older brother who was making these decisions, technically he already knew how much he was inheriting. It just had to, the devil was in the details almost. How was this going to be worked out? And he wasn't moving on it. Now, this could be a case of 2 brothers who were very close and very upset by the process, 2 brothers that had nothing to do with each other. These could be 2 people who were incredibly greedy and wanted more than their share, or they could be a situation where the older brother just couldn't emotionally deal with the reality yet. We don't know any of that information. Just that Jesus was asked by this man to intervene to help the process. Now, as normal in Gospels, when we look at it, these settings are not isolated. They're always to put a teaching moment into place. Because Jesus never actually answers the young man. He never tells him what's going to happen. But he does turn to the crowd and he talks about inheritance and he says, I'm going to tell you a story. And we always know when Jesus tells a story, it's not nearly a surface level story. There's always more to it. So he starts on the story of the rich fool and talking about this man who was going on and on and on about how he had all this stuff and his fields had produced so well, and he was going to tear down his barns and build new ones, and it was just going to be bigger and bigger, and he was going to have all this stuff, and he was going to be able to eat and drink and be merry for the rest of his life. Now, if you were a first century person hearing that, you would have a whole lot of questions. Like, first, why tear down the barns? Just build more. Why store in the first place? There was need in the community. Why store grain and wine, stuff that was going to perish? It wasn't going to last that long anyway, so you might as well use it, or else you're going to have a few silos of complete rot. But the thing that really made this man a fool wasn't all of these other superficial questions. The thing that really made this guy a fool was his constant talking about himself. I. If you look at the gospel, it's the main pronoun being used. He even talks to himself at one point in time and says, self, you are so smart. The arrogance of this man is what makes him the fool. Jesus used this story to show an example of when we put our value in earthly items, in accumulating of stuff. This man talked about riches of food, but it can also look at riches of gold and possessions and furniture and housing and deck patio furniture and all sorts of stuff that we keep accumulating, thinking it's going to make us secure, that we're going to have a happy old age. And then God goes and says, time's up. You're done tonight. All of that effort to put aside for your a future that was never guaranteed in the first place, and now it's gone. So how do we take that into our lives? Because, estate planning is a smart thing to do. Funeral planning is a very smart thing to do. Letting your children, your inheritors, know what your plans are and wants are is a very smart thing to do. Having enough put aside so you can live reasonably is a smart thing to do. None of that is what Jesus is talking about. We're talking here about someone who is so focused on themselves, so obsessed with themselves, that they did not see how they were part of the world. And when they were dying, who else was in place and ready to take over? And how dare they think that they alone were the ones who accumulated all of this wealth? If you were a rich farmer, you had servants, you had staff, you had workers. There was never an acknowledgement in this man that he didn't do things alone. It's kind of analogous to the whole self-made man concept that the Americans hold on to too tightly, and everybody else kind of says that's foolish. But we kind of have an affinity for that in a lot of ways. God is trying to remind all of us that we are interconnected. Our possessions are only temporary. Even if they are things that can last the tales of time, we can't. We have an end date. We have a finite time for this body. We have the promise of resurrection. Our energy, our spirit is going to continue. And there's many places in the gospel that remind us that we will not look like us. We will not need our possessions in the next world. So what we have right now is not going to protect us from anything. It's not going to provide endlessly for us. If we get sick, it does not matter how many doilies we inherited from our great aunt. It won't make a difference. It will not matter how much we're able to count the money in our bank account if we have not been able to share it with the people that we care about. They will see that as a distancing, and wealth does that. Possessions do that. They put wedges between people. The message in all of this is not to not acquire, because part of it is just common sense as far as living comfortably in a world without having to be dependent on someone else. Because there have been experiments done where people have boasted, that you can find them on the internet as well. People have boasted how they've lived purchase free for a year. What they don't talk about is they might not have purchased things, but they were counting on other people to purchase things for them, or they were taking advantage of people who had already done that work and given them a portion. So it wasn't actually free. They actually had purchasing. They just didn't do it personally. We're not talking about living in a world where we don't do things to provide for ourselves. We have to. We're talking about living in a world where we are so in control of the quantity of our acquisitions that we fail to remember that all of this, all of the things we have provided, all the relationships we have, they're all gifts of God. They're not anything that did not come first from some form of God's love for us. And it is our responsibility to give that back as much as humanly possible. In the case of the rich fool, he had food stored. How many people were hungry? How many people were thirsty? How many people wanted to have a share in that bounty? How many worked to create that bounty and were still struggling themselves? We cannot hold our possessions so dear and think we are protected in life. It makes us a fool. God provides for us, and that's probably one of the hardest things as Christians we're ever asked to do, trust in God to provide. But in the meantime, we can be in the active process of getting rid of possessions that really kind of stand in the way. Happy families start sending off the items they're meant to inherit before death even happens. Families who want to support their family, they don't wait till life insurance kicks in. They give their children while they're there alive, or social engagements or organizations or something they believe in. People who want to spare families grief, they start doing the planning of their end before it's even a matter of needing to happen. My family knows what I expect. In fact, my mother used to tell this story of when she was preaching, how this minister was saying, "Oh, these people who want to plan their own funerals, and they're using the song from Frank Sinatra, 'I Did It My Way.' I can't think of anything more hideous." And my mother started to laugh, and she said, "Oh, my daughter's planning on using that as her main song." Our way is not a bad way to go, but it's within community. It's within recognizing that nothing we own is going to be with us forever. As is commonly said, you do never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul. Nothing we have is going into the next life. So don't make it the focus of this life. There are so many other ways to spend your time and energy and the unknown days we have. Preparing for a future, not a bad idea. Isolating yourself, thinking you have done everything you need to secure that future, that's a problem. Share, trust, be generous. Don't obsess about possessions. Divest as much as you can. And then you also get the benefit of seeing their faces as thanks. That's the upside of being generous and sharing and not waiting until you're long gone. Christ wants us to recognize where our value should be placed. And it is never going to be in how rich we are or how big our bank account is.